Welcome to our fourth week of our 5-week series called Let's Make a Deal. It may sound a bit inappropriate, at least strange, to be talking about a game show when the world is in such a mess. But as I thought about it, it makes a lot more sense than one would initially think. As in life, game shows are built on some good decisions and a bit of luck. By luck, I mean chance more than I mean superstition. Right now, everyone is trying to make some good decisions, but frankly, we're also hoping for a little bit of luck. Now, we don't like being hampered from some of our lifestyles, doing the things we normally do. But we don't want to catch this virus or have too many other hardships revolving around this crisis. The people that we love getting the virus. Certainly there's hardships revolving money and education and just fellowship time with other people. Now, in this series, we've been talking about how everyone wants a good deal in life and how people make decisions accordingly. This is true of our spiritual life as well. This series is about how the Christian life requires some training and discipline. But if we can put up with some of that training and endure some of that discipline, it actually makes our life better down the road. But it's hard for us. Like much of society, we want it all now. We think about short-term goods. But if we can just bear with it and discipline ourselves, we get some long-term greats that are much better than the short-term goods. Now, our current health situation is currently imposing some disciplines on us right now. And this idea of fasting or going without something for a period of time is not ultimately meant to make our life miserable. It's actually meant to make our life better. Again, if you can live beyond the moment and see the big picture. Do you see the parallel between the times that we're in now and the fasting and then dealing with this coronavirus and the idea of fasting and giving up something temporarily so that you can down the road experience greater joy? We are proposing that if you can create a good balance in your life of fasting and feasting, your life will actually flourish. It will get better. Instead of feasting all the time and getting everything you want right away, there needs to be a both and, a better balance. Now, those who have been praying and or fasting, I want to commend you. I think you've done 3 weeks and hopefully 3 weeks to go as we work towards Easter. Over this series, I've tried to teach you about fasting from different perspectives. Number one, a health perspective, where we talked about food and diet. Number two, a mental perspective, where we talked about our body image. We tried to understand how our bodies and our souls are linked together. And number three, a spiritual perspective, where we looked at what the Bible teaches us about fasting and what Jesus tells us to do with fasting. Now, there's one more bit of teaching I want to share about fasting. See, while most people tend to think of fasting as an action used to get a response, so in other words, the action is done by people to get a response from God, and while this has much truth to it, it has some dangers as well. So if we diagram it, it looks like this. Our action brings about God's response. And while it is always good and right to want more of God in our lives and try to become more like Christ, there are dangers in trying to manipulate God. And I guess that's one major reason why fasting began to fade out over time. It became sort of the good works to earn God's favor type of thing, which was never what it was intended to be. And human beings have this habit of messing things up, don't they? And we've always struggled with this type of thing that starts out good and we kind of mess it up, from good theology to bad theology. In fact, many people today still think we are saved by good works, or in other words, if we diagrammed it, God's actions, or our actions, which is good deeds, brings about God's approval and salvation. There couldn't be anything farther from the truth. In fact, good theology would probably look more like this. God loves us and accepts us as we are. That changes us, and we respond by surrendering our lives to Him. And that brings about the response of the Spirit to come and empower us to live better, to make our actions more righteous. But initially, we are the responders, not the initiators. In other words, fasting isn't so much about an action to get a response, but rather more so about just life giving us these sacred moments that get us to react. And then, of course, God and the Spirit respond. So the coronavirus, as terrible as it is, it creates a sacred moment for us to react to. We are called to pray and to fast. The diagram might look more like this. The coronavirus, as strange as it sounds, creates a sacred moment for us where we pray and fast and ultimately bring about God's response as He so chooses. This process takes away some of the temptation to use fasting for our own purposes, but to use it as a response to a need. Actually, a sacred moment can be just about anything that calls us towards fasting. Let me give you some examples. Some of these examples you would think, really, that's a sacred moment? But death, sin, fear, threat, needs, and sickness, not that they are initiated by God, on the contrary, but they create a sacred moment in our life. God's response could be a number of things. It could be life, forgiveness, safety, hope, answers, health, strength, hope. It goes on and on. God chooses how to respond. So what are we fasting for and or praying for at this time? Well, we participated in body discipline, body turning, body pleading. If you don't know those terms, I encourage you to go back and listen to some audio sermons of this last series. But this week we're going to do some body grieving. See, fasting and praying are directly linked in a natural response to death. And we grieve when someone dies. Now, grief can be the loss of a loved one, but it can be broader than that. We can grieve for lost souls in our society. It can be that we grieve for the suffering that this virus is causing in people's lives, both the virus itself, but just, again, finances, education, lack of community, all those things we can grieve for. Now, going back to the idea of grieving someone we've lost to death. When someone dies, often what happens to the grieving person is they lose their appetite. And we often tell them to eat something to keep up their strength, especially if they're elderly, which is so important. But we must not be so quick to dismiss this strong link between grieving and fasting. When Saul was out to kill David in the Bible, Jonathan grieved by fasting for what he assumed would be the inevitable death of David. 1 Samuel 20:34 says, Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger on that second day of the feast. He did not eat because he was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. Well, as it turned out, David didn't die, but both Saul and Jonathan did. Then it was David who fasted when he said, when David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. But grief doesn't have to be just about physical death. We read last week about Jesus' disciples feasting while Jesus was with them, but fasting after he left. Luke 5:35 says, but the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and in those days they will fast. We grieve for many things, including the loss of peace and love and justice in this world. Today I'm going to give you one passage to take home with you. I've been giving you three, but this one's a little bit long, so we're going to stick with one today. Psalm 77, 1 through 15. I usually don't use the Message paraphrase because it is a paraphrase, not a translation, but I'm making an exception today because the one thing that the paraphrase does is it makes it personal. Use modern wording to help you make it personal. So I'm going to read that scripture to you right now in the Message paraphrase. I yell out to my God. I yell with all my might. I yell at the top of my lungs, and he listens. I found myself in trouble and went looking for my Lord. My life was an open wound that wouldn't heal. When friends said everything will turn out all right, I didn't believe a word they said. I remember God and I shake my head. I bow my head and wring my hands. I'm awake all night, not a wink of sleep, and I can't even say what's bothering me. I go over the days one by one. I ponder the years gone by. I strum my lute all through the night, wondering how to get my life together. Will the Lord walk off and leave us for good? Will he never smile again? Is his love worn threadbare? Has his salvation promise burned out? Has God forgotten his manners? Has he angrily stalked off and left us? Just my luck, I said. The high God goes out of business just the moment I need him. Once again, I'll go over what God has done and lay out on the table the ancient wonders. I'll ponder all the things you've accomplished, God, and give a long, loving look at your acts. Oh, God, your way is holy. No God is great like God. You're the God who makes things happen. You showed everyone what you can do. You pulled your people out of the worst kind of trouble and rescued the children of Jacob and Joseph. Now this psalm is really a psalm of grief, isn't it? You can almost see him move, the author here, move through the stages of grief. First he expresses some shock, some anger, but he eventually moves to comfort and healing as he reminds himself what God has done in the past to save his people. You know, we really need to ask ourselves right now, if we're ever going to treat prayer seriously, if we're ever even going to try fasting, wouldn't it be now? I mean, we're facing a health crisis. This is a sacred moment. And number two, we're being imposed this discipline on our lives where many of us have time to fast and to pray. So if we won't do it now, when will we do it? There's no basketball game to watch tonight, my friends. But there's time to pray and even fast. Now, for some of you have already established your fasting challenge, and I think you've probably made it to go until Easter, at least many people have. And you've already just need to keep up what you're doing, and I encourage you to do that. But for some of us, we're using a different approach. We're kind of increasing our fasting time each week and making it harder as we go, so it's just not one big humongous thing at one time. So we're using the reducing window plan. Now for last week, many of us continued to give up our pleasure 16 hours in a row, 3 days a week, right? Which included sleep time. The other days, the 3 other days, we just went 12 hours, I believe. So in other words, I fasted from 7 p.m. to 11 a.m. And of course, you're trying to add in time with God during those hours of fasting. So we're going to continue to fast 3 days a week for 16 hours. But for now, for 3 other days of the week, we're going to fast for 23 straight hours. You have a 1 hour window to enjoy your food or your pleasure. So for me, that's going to be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 5:30 to 6:30. And then, of course, on Sunday, enjoy your pleasure during your 12-hour window. Don't overindulge, but enjoy the gifts God gives you. Now, if all this is a little bit confusing and you're either behind or you're not certain what I'm saying about this fasting and reducing window plan, please text me or call me or email me, and I'll make sure and respond back to you. But for now, I encourage you. This is the week for body grief. Grieve with your body and your soul together. Grieving has always had a strong tie to fasting. It's not something we do all the time, but it's important for us to do when a sacred moment happens. We respond to the sacred moment at hand. And this world, through this virus, has created a sacred moment for God's people. Have a blessed day. Thanks.